Hello, everyone. My name is Carl Jeffrey from Carbon Capture Journal in London and Finding Petroleum, and welcome to our webinar about CO2 storage monitoring. So ever since we've discussed putting carbon dioxide into the subsurface, we've known there was going to be a challenge knowing where the CO2 is going. And we've known there's a tried and tested technology for understanding gases in the subsurface, which is repeated 3D seismic surveys, which we use in gas exploration and production, but that involves very expensive ships doing operations for weeks and then expensive data processing. And it would be great if we could get the understanding we need from less expensive technologies. So a British study group has been looking into this, and we're going to hear the results of their study today. And the technologies they recommended are measuring gravity changes, doing repeated straight line or 2D seismic surveys, fiber optic cables recording seismic on the surface, fiber optic cables for recording seismic in wells, and microseismic, which listens for sounds created in the subsurface. The study group is called the CCUS Transport and Storage Task Force Monitoring Subgroup, and members include Halliburton, BP, Eni, and Shell. We're going to hear today from Ian Barron, who's Senior Geoscientist with the North Sea Transition Authority and a former geophysicist with Shell and BG Group. He's one of the lead authors of the study, and he's joining us from Aberdeen. We're going to have a presentation from Ian of about 20 minutes, then we'll take your questions, and the questions will be moderated by Robert Hines. He's Senior Consultant with Carbon Capture and Storage with Arup, and he's joining us from Oxford. You can put questions in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll take them at the end. And we're going to dismiss questions that aren't directly related to the topic of the webinar, which is understanding the work of the study group. So I'd like to invite Ian to start your talk. Cheers.
Great, thanks very much, Carl. I'm just sharing the slides, so
Yep.
Robert, if you could just let me know when they've come up.
Yep.
Yep, we can see them.
Brilliant. Okay, great. Thanks very much for the introduction, Carl. So yeah, my name's Ian Barron. I work in the carbon transportation and storage team up here in the NSTA in Aberdeen. And Carl's asked me to talk about the conclusions of the report that I was involved in as a member of the CTS task force's monitoring subgroup, which we published about a year ago now. That report was looking into alternatives or ways to reduce the reliance on 4D seismic in order to be able to monitor carbon storage sites. So I'm just going to talk through some of the conclusions of that report.
So Ian, you've got a little bar that says app is sharing your screen. Can you click on the hide there so it takes that bar away?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, that's not your fault.
There we go. That's gone now. Yeah, so just for those of you who are not familiar, I've got this slide for the NSTA and sort of what we do. There are three main buckets of work that we're responsible for with interdependencies and feedback between them. The first one obviously is energy production and energy security. That feeds into our principal or primary objective, which is maximizing economic recovery. And it also links into natural gas and now hydrogen storage offshore. Second piece is around emissions reduction, clean power generation, reduction in flaring and venting, and things like zero routine flaring, for instance. And then the third piece is accelerating the transition, which is where I sit. And that's obviously focused today on carbon transport and storage. Great. So I just want to go back a step before I talk about the conclusions of the report, and I've just got this slide in to sort of talk about framing what monitoring is, why we ask for monitoring plans, and what's necessary, what do they have to deliver, because I think that needs to set the context around the report and around some of the technologies that we'll talk about. So this is an excerpt from the storage regulations, 2010 storage regulations. That is what drives the stewardship and the content of the licenses that we award and the permits that we grant for carbon storage. So it's quite dry. There's a picture to look at while I talk, but fundamentally the licensees, the applicants for a storage permit, will need to demonstrate that they can compare the actual and model behavior of the injected CO2. So is your store behaving as you expect it to? Can you history match your models in an adequate way? Can you detect a significant irregularity where the CO2 is absolutely not behaving as it should be or as it was predicted to? which might be evolving into a scenario where leakage would occur? Can it detect migration of CO2? Now that's movement within the storage site and potentially into the storage complex. It needs to be able to detect that. Obviously, it needs to be able to detect leakage, because the main criteria that we or one of the main criteria, I should say, that we assess the permit application on is that there is no significant risk of leakage or harm to the environment or harm to human health. That then starts to speak to the next piece down, which is detecting any adverse effects on the environment. And then obviously monitoring needs to be able to assess the effectiveness of any corrective measures that need to be applied in order to correct a significant irregularity or a leak. And then finally, I think this is always an important one. I've talked about no significant risk of leakage. I think we can all appreciate that the what's in the containment risk assessment at the point of permit application will evolve as our knowledge and understanding of the stores increases through injection and through data gathering from the monitoring plan. So that monitoring data needs to enable the update of the containment risk assessment. So that monitoring plan itself really needs to be bespoke per store, clearly, but it has to be also fundamentally based around the expected behavior of the CO2 and the risks that have been identified in that CRA. So the monitoring plan also needs to be updated every 5 years post permit award, and that's in order to keep current, keep abreast of new technology, and also to keep it in line with that evolving risk assessment picture. The behavior, as I said, is unlikely to be exactly as predicted, and so if you have a risk which is evolving at a faster rate or at a slower rate, you've got the opportunity to adjust the monitoring plan. There's a range of available technologies. The picture on the right-hand side is just for absolutely non-seismic. But even when we talk about seismic, it's not all about 4D seismic. It's not going to work in every case. I think we can understand that. The rock physics are not always favorable, for instance, reservoir depths or store depths, I should say, etc. So I think that's kind of where we started from. In the 4D seismic won't always work, and even when it does work, it's quite expensive. And I'll come on to some of the other reasons why we want to look at that. So why move away from conventional 4D seismic? So repeat seismic, it's routinely talked about and proposed as a core technology for monitoring CO2 stores. I think as I come from a hydrocarbon background as an asset geophysicist, and I know that seismic is expensive. It's always difficult to justify. It's got a long lead time. You'd think about the permitting time to go out and acquire a survey, to permit it in the first place, to actually then go and get the boat out there and shoot it. You've then got a processing time, and then you've obviously got the interpretation time on top of that. So it's quite a lengthy lead time, I think. So if you look at it from the point of view of what can I acquire to tell me if everything's behaving, you could potentially have an irregularity, for instance, and it might take you a couple of years to detect it with seismic by the time you've gone out and shot it and processed it and permitted it, etc., and then interpreted it. I think from an environmental perspective, people are starting to consider the noise budget offshore. Obviously, seismic does involve a noise budget and has an environmental impact associated with it. It's quite an intense activity. I think we talk about, LUPs, I think some surveys have been done that are the largest man-made moving object on Earth, just based on the density and the length of the streamers and the vessel. So as I said, it's got a pretty significant impact environmentally, potentially. Co-location, I don't want to get into this too much, but I think if you're looking at offshore wind being on the edge of some of the carbon storage sites, there are proposed wind farms, for instance, in the East Irish Sea, which are close to the proposed Morecambe area CO2 store. And I think the licensees in those scenarios need to look at whether seismic is appropriate and possible where you've got a wind farm. And I suspect, I think our sense is that it's not practical. And then finally, you've got the CO2 detection ability. Can your seismic actually see the CO2 in the store to start with? If you're in an aquifer, like the Bunter in the southern North Sea, then 4D seismic should work pretty well from a detection point of view. If you're looking at, for instance, the Le Mans sandstone much further down in the Permian, and as a depleted reservoir, you're unlikely to see a significant CO2 signal. You can argue that you may see a time shift based on the seismic. However, you do need to be able to robustly interpret the base of the store at that point. And when we're looking at things like the base Permian nonconformity, that's not necessarily straightforward. So I think there's all these things mixing up that start to talk about some of the challenges of why we don't necessarily want to rely on 4D all the time. So the report that or the study that I was involved in, which generated the report, had a few objectives really. We wanted to really fundamentally improve the understanding we had as a group of the technologies that could reduce the reliance of 4D seismic. We were looking for things that could have a potential deployment over the Track 1 and Track 2 stores that the licensees and the storage operators can start to think about. And then we were looking for opportunities to improve the resolution, try and reduce the cost, reduce the lead time, and lower that environmental impact. And so those are all pieces that I've talked about in why 4D is a challenge sometimes. So our kind of aspiration coming out the back of it was then to try and enable and encourage some more field trials and testing of some of these alternative technologies, which sometimes have a lower TRL than technologies that are known about already. We were trying to also help maximize the chance of success for CO2 storage projects by trying to reduce the cost and improve efficiency. Once we get out of the once we go towards the market model, then that cost reduction piece is going to be much more important. And then we're also trying to encourage more cross-industry collaboration between the different operators and the different licensees in the areas, trying to move away from that petroleum piece or that petroleum behavior where a lot of the time data is kind of confidential and it's held in it's held in and not necessarily shared quite as widely as it might do. So some of that data sharing piece would improve the testing of some of these. So onto the sort of the core recommendations. I think the first one we looked at was or recommended was time-lapse gravity, and so 4D gravity, I guess. There's been some good work from individual licensees already on this, but it's got the potential to look at shallow reservoirs, potentially also deeper reservoirs as well, and it could be also beneficial in areas where you do have some co-location on the edge, where you don't necessarily you can't necessarily get a seismic vessel in with streamers, but you could put some plinths on the seabed with your gravity monitoring stations. The second piece on this was looking at different types of seismic. So, okay, well, we've talked about 3D and some of the issues around that. Is there a way to do time-lapse 2D? Does that work? Is that practical? Can we do some repeat 2D lines? Again, we're looking here at saying, okay, targeted areas based on your risk assessment. Do you need a big 3D every, let's say 2 or 3 years, or are you just interested in demonstrating that the CO2 is not leaking over one of your key risk areas, such as your spill point or such as through a fault? Can you get away with doing some 2D lines over there? And so, and I think that's also come on a little bit further since we wrote this report, where you've got companies like Spotlight who are out there promoting their spot, which is almost like 1D time-lapse seismic. And I'm personally really looking forward to seeing the results of that. That they're currently undergoing the tests around the Poseidon injection test that's going on in the southern North Sea. So that's an example of some other technologies that are coming in, which we didn't necessarily consider at the time, but you can link into this as well. We also looked at time-lapse surface DAS. So again, it's an evolution away from sort of conventional 4D seismic, but can you just put some DAS on the seabed? Can you deploy fiber on the seabed and use a passive and an active source at different times to generate a seismic signal? It's a bit more of an emerging technology. I know there's companies out there who are pushing it. What we'd really like to see again is some more trials of this. But again, as I said, that this is a way of doing some monitoring at maybe an earlier stage before you might want to trigger something a bit more intensive. We also discussed around time-lapse VSP or DAS VSP effectively. Can you put some DAS fiber down the wells, monitor using active sources, maybe in injection wells and passive sources in the monitor well, for instance? We've seen that you can get repeat seismic VSPs or 4D VSPs in the hydrocarbon world. They can be required relatively quickly. It's got a relatively small footprint because you're literally just looking at a source around the wellbore. So from that perspective, it's proven. The unproven bit maybe relates around the rock physics of your individual store and where you're putting the CO2. But again, those pieces were things that we thought, okay, well, this is worth investigating so that we can have a scaled and bespoke approach to monitoring for individual stores where you don't necessarily need a great big 3D or 4D, I should say. every few years, but you might want to have that as a triggered monitoring option rather than your standard baseline, if you like, or your standard core monitoring technique. And then finally, we looked at surface microseismic, and so that's really kind of trying to look at aerially. Are you seeing any seismicity, natural, induced? Can you use that to assess the geomechanical stability, and can you possibly use that as well to assess where your plume is moving if you're picking up these little microseismic signals? How do you do that? Do you need technology down the well? Can you get away with doing it at the seabed, or even on your injection platform, if you're going for a platform-based development? So these are all questions that we asked, and we said, okay, this is what needs to be. These are some of the technologies that have got potential, but more needs to be done to bring that TRL up to a point where we're more comfortable with including it in the monitoring plan. So some of the opportunities of this, I think we looked at cost sharing, and we thought that is there a way to improve efficiency from a cost perspective? If you go and acquire your data or your surveys with other operators, whether that's gravity, 2D seismic, whatever else, that might deliver a cost and an environmental benefit. You're going to reduce the cost around mobilization, demobilization of equipment. You're potentially also going to include environmental benefits if you're only sailing out from harbour once and then back at the end of 2 or 3 or 4 surveys, for example. Is there an opportunity to look at shared networks? I'm thinking here really around the passive or natural and induced seismicity monitoring. Also in the southern North Sea, there's potentially quite closely spaced stores, whether you're looking at the Bunter or the Le Mans. Your storage complexes may abut or potentially overlap, and so your monitoring might also need to extend beyond the complex, depending on the risks and what you think you need to monitor. We've got a workshop convened next week here at the NSTA with the current licensees just to talk about what needs to be what monitoring they think they need from a seismicity perspective, but that's really in that vein of trying to encourage conversation and collaboration around shared networks. And then finally, the opportunity piece around data sharing, because that really facilitates learning and development of these, and it also enables us to leverage learnings from the testing. What's appropriate in one store, what's appropriate in another store, for instance. There's a lot of companies out there doing individual studies on technology appropriateness, for instance, and whether it might fit in that particular store. I think there's an opportunity for maybe whether it's a JIP or it's an industry consortium group to get together and say, okay, let's all co-fund a single study on the different ways that, let's say, gravity might work, or DAS, surface DAS on the seabed might work. What are the conditions for that, rather than having to repeat the same studies a number of different times? So that kind of links me onto the recommendations. We wanted industry to try and start to get together to look at desktop feasibility studies, followed by required field trials to bring the TRLs up on that. There are multiple different pathways. It could be regulator-led studies, which is what the passive seismic or the seismicity workshop is. Could be industry partnerships, where when one licensee says, hey, look, we've got a study that we're going to do on this new technology. We'd really like to share that and share the cost and share the benefits together. I think the other piece is around continued conversation on future monitoring. So again, it comes back to that knowledge sharing piece. It'd be really nice to see the track 1, track 2 projects, when they go further forward, to start to share the knowledge of their results with the other licensees, rather than just waiting for that data to be released. And I think then that again brings me on to the piece around establishment of a framework for data sharing. So that's outside of the regulatory requirements. The monitoring results do need to be reported to the NSTA annually, and so data will have to be reported, retained, so it's a typo, and that should say retained, not retailed, and then disclosed. Now that is pending legislation, but it's going to be very much in the same form that the petroleum data is reported, retained, and disclosed. But what I'd really like to see is that is more widely a wider take up of data sharing among different licensees, different storage operators, because I think that's really going to support learning dissemination, more rapid take-up of technologies, what works, what doesn't work, what's not worth including in the monitoring plans, what's not worth spending money on, because it's not adding enough value to us, it's not demonstrating enough. And again, then finally, that discussion again between the storage operators is what does this new data that we've got mean? How do we interpret it to say, actually, look, this is demonstrating no leakage or no irregularities. It's demonstrating conformance and behaviour in line with our expectations. So I think just to sum up, I've probably spoken for nearly 20 minutes now. So going back to the beginning, the monitoring plan needs to be really closely linked to the CRA, the containment risk assessment. Both of those documents are key parts of the permit application. And so that monitoring plan then needs to deliver against those requirements as are set out in the storage regulations. There's lots of different ways or different opportunities I think we've got to reduce reliance on 4D seismic. I think it's still got a place in some stores. I think also from a behavioural perspective, it's going to be quite powerful in some of the early store developments to help us understand subsurface behaviour of CO2 and really get a good handle on history matching. Potentially, even if you can't see the behavior of the CO2 within the store, you could potentially use it. You could potentially use the 4D seismic to demonstrate no leakage into the overburden aquifer, for instance, at the end of store life, where you're monitoring to demonstrate there's no leakage and it's permanently and safely contained. So there is a place, I think, in some instances for 4D. What we like to see within the NSTA, we really encourage new technologies to be deployed. What we'd like to see, though, is that if they're in the monitoring plan as opposed to field trials, they'd really need to be deployed along more proven methods in the first instance, just to demonstrate that they are robust and that they are showing us data and results that are consistent with what we already understand. Excuse me. And that can be either through field trials, or it could be in the first instance, the first iteration of the monitoring plan. And then you've got those opportunities every 5 years or more frequently, if you wish, as an operator, to update your monitoring plan and come to us at the NSTA and say, hey guys, I'd really like to update my monitoring plan. I've got this new technology. Are you guys comfortable if I reduce the frequency of my 4D, or I reduce the frequency of some other big, expensive and intensive technology, and I use this? And that's a conversation that we'd welcome having. And then finally, I think there's a significant opportunity here for cost reduction and also data sharing. And again, that's something that I think can only benefit everyone operating in the basin. That's kind of all I had to say. I just wanted to flag then to thank the co-authors of this report and the co-venturers, I guess, or the member organisations, which is NE, CCSA, Harbour Energy, NEP, which has got the first carbon storage permit, OEUK, Storega, and the Subsurface Taskforce. I've got a link on the bottom of the slides here to the final version of the report, which I think is also shared on the Taskforce page on LinkedIn. So I think that's all I had. So I can happy to open it up for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Ian. Okay, so we're open for questions. If you'd like to put questions in the Q&A box, perhaps about some of the specific technologies, and I shall pass over to Robert, who's going to moderate the questions. Cheers.
Well, thank you so much for that, Ian. Super, super interesting, especially as someone who's worked in monitoring for about 10 years now, and very much sort of been assumed that 4D seismic is going to be, the absolute gold standard and first. But on the flip side of that, hearing how much complaining there is about the cost of that as well. So I think sort of first question from myself is, are there any of the sort of track 1 or track 2 clusters who've got monitoring plans which don't involve 4D seismic that have been approved by the NSTA at the moment?
So I can't talk about the specific projects at the moment. I'd have to ask well, I think NZNSS is the operator, but that's effectively Northern Endurance Partnership. I'd have to ask them to present on their monitoring plan, because the contents of that is not something that's in the public domain at the moment. I am starting to see licensees come through, maybe track 2 and beyond track 2, so licensees from the first licensing round, where there's a discussion going on about whether 4D is appropriate. And within that group as well, there are companies out there saying 4D is not going to work for us. The rock physics just don't support it. So we're looking at alternatives. We're looking at 4D gravity. Here's a study that we've done with a contractor, and they are this is what a 4D gravity response might look like. This is how we think we can use it to demonstrate the conformance. So that conversation is already happening. I think that speaks back to the point I was making about more collaboration. Those studies are ongoing in a number of different licenses. It's a number of different licensees all effectively repeating the same studies in some senses. So one opportunity we've got is for people to club together and to get together and say, hey, look, yes, okay, we need to do some detailed feasibility for our own specific store once we've got some dynamic models when we're closer to the permit application point. So we can demonstrate, okay, how long is it going to be before we would see a response? But I mean, in gravity set terms, it could be 6 months. So you could get a pretty quick response from that. Whereas 4D seismic, you might need to take a little bit of a longer period. So I think studies, but the earlier phase of those studies where you're doing a little bit more broad work to say, okay, roughly in this depth of reservoir is good, in this depth of reservoir it's okay. I think those kind of broader studies, maybe we could get together earlier and as a group to try and get a sense. It then gives you a bit more of an option on the shopping basket to say, okay, I've got my store in this depth range or in this geology, this basin type, if you like, or geology type. And therefore, these are the things that are most appropriate. It's a little bit like a more detailed version or a slightly smarter version of the IEA GHG's monitoring tool that they've got, if people have seen that. So.
Maybe a sort of a quite similar one, a question from Jonathan Osmond here. What are your thoughts on the feasibility of repeated 2D surveys rather than 3D ones? Have those been proposed much offshore in the UK so far? So I think that probably might have some crossover with, combined surveys and trying to bring down your cost and your complexity of still doing seismic surveys.
Yeah. I think it's not something that we've seen proposed at this time. It is something that is under discussion, or it's on that list of things that could be used. But it's not something that's been actively proposed at this point. But it is something that is an opportunity. Again, it comes back to that point around what do I need to monitor for? Have I got cheaper ways to monitor for plume conformance? You might say, okay, I'm going to use gravity for my main conformance tool, but I want a higher resolution or a higher fidelity image or more detailed image around a key spill point, for instance. And so you might say, I'll use 2D seismic lines to demonstrate that. But again, that would be very much dependent on the geology, the rock physics, etc., and the orientation and how you're going to require it, etc.
Great. People are very keen on seismic, so we've got another question from Diego Vasquez Anzola here. So thanks for a great presentation within that. Please share your reflections on the use of active seismic in depleted fields for conformance purposes. Would 4D gravity play a more significant role here? Have you guys discussed service providers?
So I think in depleted fields, again, it depends whether you're looking at maybe depleted oil versus depleted gas fields. In depleted gas fields, I think gravity has got a much stronger role to play personally, in terms of its reliability and its ability to help you with your conformance monitoring. I think in that instance, so it's a little bit, you can use it to detect leaks in the overburden, I believe, from what I've seen in the modeling. 4D seismic again might have that ability to detect leakage in the overburden or in the aquifer beyond the spill point, for instance, although gravity can do that as well. So I think there is a role to play. If you're looking at depleted oil fields, then again, potentially gravity could work there. 4D seismic could also work there again, because you're looking at injecting a gas into a depleted oil field. So maybe the rock physics might be a little bit more favorable than for a depleted gas field. I hope that answers the question. I think there was a second part possibly that I didn't pick up.
Have you just discussed with any service providers who might be out there looking to do it? I
so
don't know if the NSTA.
No, that's okay. So we do have conversations with service providers. We We have opinions on technologies, which we will share with the operators as they come to propose them. We've had service companies in to demonstrate their capabilities, which is useful, and their opinion on their technologies. And we've also had my sort of preferred way of working with the service providers is when they come in as a partnership with the licensees, and then they present together as a unified team, if you like, where they've been working really closely with the service companies have been working really closely with the licensees. So that is on their specific licenses. So yes, I think is the answer.
Great, thanks. No, I thought no. There's people out there who will happily do it for you. So a question from James Verdon here, and he did mention about sort of having parallel technologies deployed to monitor where one's at a sort of lower TRL. And he's saying, to what extent is the NSTA comfortable with testing whilst doing? For some technologies, the only way we'll really know how well they work is to deploy them on a commercial scale storage, i.e. where small scale tests may not be sufficient to fully understand monitoring capabilities. And I always get a bit confused when you get up to the really high TRL of technology. You can sort of argue the case about, whether it's tested in a representative environment or in a field environment and that kind of thing. So I think that there'll always be sort of some questions about that real credibility of the technology, which could force people into sort of, having to back this up with 4D seismic. So
yeah,
it'd be interesting to hear the NSTA's take on that.
Okay, I think testing while doing I think we are comfortable with that. Again, I come back to the point that we'd like that to have what we don't want in the monitoring plans is to have reliance on a single monitoring tool for any one thing, if that's possible, because that just increases the risk of either a false positive or a false negative, I guess, or incorrect interpretation or incorrect information maybe coming through. So I think we're comfortable with that testing while doing piece. So as James says, some technologies might you'll only get to see if it's really working is to deploy it on a commercial scale store or a commercial scale deployment. And that's then going to be a discussion commercially for the operators to have, either with DESNES if they're track 1 or track 2, or however that model evolves post that. But we are comfortable, I think, with that.
Yeah, no, sounds very sensible. So colleague of mine from Arup, so hi Will, thanks for the question. What is your process around determining / concluding what containment loss might be a risk or unlikely? Is this primarily reflective of the operator's monitoring and corrective measures methodology? So what is the process around determining concluding be a risk? Okay, so
Yeah.
is that sort of how are you sort of how are people proposing the risk profile of the store to you, and how does that match to the monitoring approach?
So what we do, it's our stewardship approach for carbon storage is a little bit different, and it's probably a lot more in depth than it has been for hydrocarbons. Fundamentally, I suspect because we're being asked as a regulator to sign off on no significant risk of leakage. So we don't just wait for the operators to rock up with the permit application and deliver that for us to look at. We spend a lot of time working with them certainly in the early phase. Within 6 months of a license award, we ask the operators or the licensees to come to us with an early risk assessment. We have a discussion around that. We have a workshop. We ask them to have it reviewed by 2 independent experts, contractors, if you like. And so we're then trying to understand what their appetite for risk is, how they're looking at the risks, and we'll have a view on that based on what they've presented, and we'll feed back. If we say, okay, let me take legacy wells for instance. We're looking at legacy well risk. Well, we obviously look at that on all projects, but they may categorize certain wells in one way, and we would have an opinion on whether that's categorized appropriately, or whether we think actually that's not a fair categorization because your barriers are too short, for instance, or we don't really view that as a low risk. We view that as a moderate risk. Now, that's not to say that it will always stay in that bucket. It's a discussion, and then there's more work that can be proposed in order to move things from one bucket of one risk category, if you like, to another. Again, we spend a lot of time looking with the operators around their risk assessment matrix, when they're looking at likelihood, or probability and magnitude or impact to say, okay, talk me through how you're building this up, because you can't just lift and shift the hydrocarbon petroleum project based risk assessment matrix into carbon storage, because it just doesn't quite fit, certainly in the lower end. So we try to work through and have conversations around that, so that once we get to the point where the permit application comes in, we're comfortable that everything has been assessed appropriately. So I think that's a question around the risk assessment, and then that risk assessment then feeds in. It's a feeder document, or it's a lead into the monitoring plan, which then you'll be monitoring based on your bow tie, your bow ties that you've done as part of the containment risk assessment, I guess, to say, okay, well, how am I going to monitor for these risks during injection? I think the other piece around that, this is maybe a bit of a side topic, but it's looking at the risk evolution over time. Not all risks are going to have the same level. They're not all going to be at the same level for the entire length of the store. You may say, okay, I've got a risk around a legacy well. Probably the risk of leakage from that legacy well is going to be highest. Maybe it's going to be high as the CO2 reaches it. Once the CO2 reaches it and it's not leaking, then the risk will drop right off. You could then argue, say, okay, risk might pop up a bit later on. And I'm being quite blasé with the way I'm describing this, so apologies. The risk might increase later on in the project as the pressure increases and you put that well under more stress. So again, you might want to tailor your monitoring around the evolution of that risk. You might want to have ROVs at the seabed for this particular legacy well at an increased frequency early on as that CO2 plume reaches it, and then you could decrease the monitoring level later on. Equally, you might say, well, actually, I've got like 10 or 15 years before the CO2 is even going to get anywhere near this legacy well or the spill point. Therefore, I'm only going to start monitoring it 10 years before, for instance, or I'm going to update my monitoring plan. And then that also will feed into corrective measures a little bit as well, in terms of what are my triggered monitoring options. So you've got your base monitoring plan, and that's kind of a way that I like to think about it, which one of the risk assessors described it. Your base monitoring plan that's in the permit application is that's your everything's according to plan. Your corrective measures is everything is not according to plan. Something's happened which is unexpected. Now that could just be non-conformance. It could be a significant irregularity or a leak, but that then has a piece in it around triggered monitoring. So this comes back to the point I was making earlier, I think, around 4D seismic. It has a role to play. You might say, look, I've got something that's not going quite as expected based on the data that I've got through my core monitoring or my base monitoring. I'm therefore going to trigger a 4D survey. And it doesn't have to be a 4D survey over the whole site. It could be a triggered 4D survey over a relatively small area. Again, it really comes back to depending on what that risk is and what the perception of the evolution of that risk is. So hopefully that kind of makes sense and vaguely answers the question, Will.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned, oh, well, so it's very comprehensive. Thank
Oh,
you.
good.
You mentioned ROVs there, and I noticed whilst we're looking at the sort of the geophysics of this, was there any thought about layering this with seabed monitoring at all? Be that things like pockmark detection, see if there are any fluxes, their chemical detection, acoustic detection, actually in the water column itself.
Yeah, that is part of it, because the operators do need to demonstrate there's no risk of harm to the environment as well. So we do look at seabed monitoring, or the operators will look at seabed monitoring. Again, it's generally, it will tend to be based around either geological or man-made wellbore leak paths. So if you have a legacy well which you are concerned about, I think concerned about is in terms of, we don't think it's a leak risk. It's not posing a significant risk of leakage, but we are going to increase the monitoring. We're going to have some monitoring around that. Now they're all going to be AB3, the legacy wells, unless they are, let me think. The legacy wells will generally be, they should be AB3, so abandoned fully. So then the only way to intervene on that is to go and do a remediation, re-enter the well or to intersect it. So I think that around that, we're looking at subsurface monitoring from an aerial perspective and looking at the pressure evolution of the store to make sure it's not going up too high, because that could generate geological or man-made leaks either way. But then the ROVs will be able to detect bubbles, for instance, at the surface, It'll be able to detect pot marks. But again, it's that risk-based thing. It's where do you think they're going to be coming from? So those ROV surveys, I think, are quite important, certainly later on in store life and in that post-closure period where you're trying to demonstrate that, again, everything is safely and I think it's securely and permanently contained.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question from Diego here. Please comment on risk matrices that focus on risks for loss of containment, where the consequence is described in terms of possible leakage. Should we use specific risk matrices to address risks associated with storage resources, injectivity, or induced seismicity? MMV should also address these types of risk as well.
Correct. Yes. Thanks, Diego. I think so. This is what we often see, and we like to see in the early risk assessment piece, because we ask that the early risk assessment, that's that piece that's done within 6 months of the license award. We ask that that covers risks to capacity, containment, and injectivity and monitorability. So we are looking at specific, maybe the risk matrices are generic across the piece at that point in terms of likelihood or impact. But I think we do like to see those risks split out to say, okay, what's your, because for us at the early risk assessment stage, that is talking more to overall project viability. When we get towards the permit point of view, which my team deal with, or we deal with in the carbon transport and storage team deal with, that's really then around the piece around those significant risk of leakage, harm to the environment or human health. But back in the earlier days where the exploration team is stewarding the licenses and we're working up through that early risk assessment piece through to site characterization, we're really focused there as a team on, have we got a viable store here? What are the serious risks to it? So if we can't even inject anything, or we don't think we're going to be able to achieve a significant enough or material enough injection rate, is that a project risk? What are the different risks that we need to address on storage resources? What are the different risks we need to address on containment or capacity? So that's the storage resources, I guess, and leakage. And that really, those early risks, that early risk assessment then feeds into the work program that's done in the appraise phase of the license, which is sort of, 3-4 years potentially. So that early risk assessment sets up that work program and says, okay, I've got a risk to containment based on some legacy wells. So I need to go and do a lot more work on these legacy wells to understand really what's happened and whether or not I need to remediate, whether or not I can remediate, or do I then need to have a fundamental rethink about the shape and size and location of my store? Or are there just too many legacy wells there to make it worthwhile and I just need to walk away from this license? That is also an option. Injectivity risks start to talk about, that starts to feed later into your deliverability piece, and can I get away the volumes that I need to get away in order to maintain the or to meet the terms that I'm going to get in the economic license, for instance, from Ofgem. And how many wells am I going to need to have that full-time availability that the emitters need? Induced seismicity is then probably a containment risk, maybe, because you'd be looking at, am I fracturing my overburden? Am I fracturing the rock around the wells, for instance? So we do want the risk matrices in those early periods to focus on all of those different things, whereas later on, it's really focusing on the containment risk. Hopefully that answers you, Diego.
Yeah, no, happy with that. I think a good question here from Will, actually, sort of coming back to that leakage risk and that containment part. So for CO2 stores, does the NSTA expect well remediations or abandonment to meet or exceed current well requirement in cases where the wells may be on top of the store formation rather than the crests, with endurance as an example?
I'm not quite sure what you mean, Will. Do you maybe if you can type it in? I'm not sure whether you mean wells that just go into the overburden or wells that actually go into the storage formation. I mean, we do expect we would expect well remediations or abandonments to exceed current well requirements in cases where they penetrate the storage sites, for sure.
Do you think that there's sort of risk with that, with sort of legacy wells that are really quite old, and in an unknown condition?
There is a risk with that, because I think there are a lot of legacy wells out there which are not necessarily in a good state, and so that it is that those will be a significant risk to containment, and that again is why that appraise phase of the license is such a significant period. So it gives the operators time to go and work that, get the data they need, and to make a judgment on that. So yeah, I can see Will's just said legacy wells that lie in the formation, but at the top where CO2 might migrate upwards. No, I think it's across wells that penetrate the storage site. So I don't know the necessary location. Down dip. It would really depend on whether the CO2 is going to reach there or not. You might have a well on the down dip on the edge of the formation, or sorry, on the edge of the storage site where CO2 is not proposed to reach. We'd probably like that monitored, and it would be flagged as a risk, but it would be dealt with and mitigated through the carbon storage development plan, which will talk about injection rates and plume development, etc. And that will also then feed into the site and complex definition.
With some of that, you mentioned how sort of knowledge sharing is important for this, and having been around a lot of CCS events for 10 years now, I'm amazed how, and impressed and pleased to see how readily people are to share knowledge. It's got almost like a sort of kind of academic feel to it rather than a commercial feel to it. You mentioned there that sort of moving towards that merchant model. Do you think have any operators sort of expressed reservations about their ability or willingness to share information once they go into that, or a bit hesitant around it?
I don't think anyone's mentioned that at this point. I think what they're waiting for really is to see the shape of the legislation that's hopefully going to come through later this year or early next year on the retention, reporting and disclosure requirements around that. But I'm not hearing any reticence on data sharing. I think some people are concerned around commercial sensitivity, which is maybe one of the reasons why we've, why the monitoring plan is not on the public register at this point. It's referenced, which is what fulfills the requirements of the legislation, but it's not necessarily out there because I don't think we want to effectively allow or start to permit price increases because certain companies have said we'll do a seismic survey in year 3 or year 4 or whatever, and so there's an opportunity there for service companies to maybe increase the pricing if they want so wished. So I think we're trying to keep that, trying to maybe look at that from that perspective amongst others. But as I say, no one's said they're really unwilling to share this so far, which is encouraging.
Okay. Yeah, and that's probably what you'd expect them to say at this stage as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. So Diego, just come back on the well containment issue here. Shouldn't we have a quantitative risk assessment on legacy wells before we need to sort of recommend expensive interventions? And having worked quite a bit on leakage, but maybe less so in the last couple of years, I always found it's incredibly hard to quantify these, to really quantify them. You'll almost never get quantities. I almost feel like you sort of put them into buckets of there's a potential leak there, but it's not an you don't need to interfere yet, through to sort of you need to respond now, through to critical breaches kind of thing. So it'd be interesting to sort of hear NSTA's bans and ideas of risks between them.
Yeah, so we do ask the licensees to come through with a quantitative risk assessment where appropriate, and that does have then has the risk piece in there, but it has the impact and the magnitude. And so what we pointed to before, and we continue to do, is a report that Susie Daniels and her team did for Bays before it became DESNES, which I think you should be able to pick up from the government website or just search for it. But that does exactly what you said, Robert, in that it's as you say, it's incredibly difficult to quantify the precise and accurate leak rates through a legacy well. You can come up with a number, but it's going to be wrong. So what you're trying to do is come up with something in the ballpark and then put that into the likelihood bucket, because then you can demonstrate that it's not a significant risk, or there's no significant risk of leakage. And I think that's where we are at the moment. Now, there's no you know, and we have lots of discussions around what does significant risk of leakage mean. Everyone always asks us this, so we have to point them back to the EU directive, which is where that is defined. But it is that it's that combination of probability and magnitude which would call into question the store for the purposes of the development of it. But so I think we like to see the quantitative risk assessment, and we do look at an estimation of where it sits on that impact piece or magnitude piece, if you like, before we start to have conversations, say, well, look, that's going to be remediated, or that doesn't need remediation.
Great, very interesting to hear. There's that sort of, you know, we want the numbers, but we appreciate that there's margins on them as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
When you listed out, when you listed out the technologies there, is anyone looking at seabed deformation at the moment? And you know, sort of bathymetry as a monitoring process.
Yeah, people are looking at that, and that is something that's in monitoring plans that have come across my desk. You're going to get some reservoirs which might be relatively shallow, which will have uplift because you can see that they've had, you know, if you're looking at legacy hydrocarbon fields which are now depleted, you'll look at some fields where you've had seabed deformation in the opposite direction and subsidence. So some where that's happened, licensees are proposing seabed deformation monitoring as a tool. Mainly to show that what's happening is in line with expectations, because as I say, as you start to inject a volume of CO2 based on your permit, you're able to say, okay, well, my estimate is that the reservoir is going to expand this much, that's going to uplift by a certain amount, and this is the range, because there's always an uncertainty on these things, but we expect that uplift to be within these bands of uncertainty across the injection period. So they're monitoring for that. And so if you suddenly start to see increased you know, an increase in bathymetry or decrease in water depth, for instance, then you would start to say, okay, well, is that a localized effect? Is that a site-wide effect? If it's localized, then that's might suggest that you've got issues with reservoir compartmentalization that you didn't quite expect. And so again, that then feeds into the triggered monitoring and corrective measures plan, where you say, okay, well, I've got this information, I don't really know what it means, so I'm going to get some more data.
Brilliant. Ian, thank you so much for answering all those questions there.
No problem.
Absolutely fascinating. And yeah, look forward to reading the NST reports and just seeing more of this happen.
No,
So,
absolutely. It's an ongoing conversation. So I'd encourage everyone out there, whether they're operators, service companies, academics, to, you know, try and get involved and, you know, talk to the operators. You can go onto the NSTA website and you can find a list on there of all the current licensees, all the current licenses and who they've been awarded to in the first round. And you can use the GIS tools we've got on there to look at them as well. And, you know, feel free to reach out and start talking to them.
So Diego apologizes for abusing the moderator. So cheers for that. So we can get one last question in. Any thoughts on monitoring technologies for inaccessible legacy wells beyond ROVs? Have we considered micro deformation tools for this purpose, but not yet tested?
I don't think micro deformation tools are something that I've come across recently. Again, I think it then comes back to the risk of the risk on these things. How much do you need to monitor it, and why? So that, as I said, that comes back to, you know, what do you think is going to happen if you're starting to, you know, I think when we issue a permit, we will put operational limits on that in terms of injection volumes, injection rates, and injection pressures. And that then comes back to that risk assessment piece that says, okay, well, if I increase the reservoir pressure to X, it's fine. But if I increase it to Y, it's not fine. And that starts to increase the risk to an unacceptable level around the legacy well. So it's around what is required. So I think, as I said, these things will evolve as we start to operate these things and inject. We'll get more information, and we'll start to have a better understanding of what the limits are and how that might impact things like legacy wells. So apologies, Diego, for not really answering that properly. But you didn't apologise for abusing the speaker as well as the moderator.
Yeah, no, absolutely no problem. Great to see people asking questions and engaging. It's one of those subjects which sounds so dry, and then like you get into the actual practicalities of it, and
Yeah.
there's just so much
There
to
really is.
unpack.
Yeah, there's quite, it's a few short lines. There's actually quite a lot of lines really relative to everything else in the storage regulations. But when you look at what it means and what people need to do, it then triggers a whole load of more stuff.
Oh yeah. Carl, I think that's it for questions at the moment. So thank you very much to Carbon Capture Journal for hosting this, and I'll pass back to yourself.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. I feel like we're getting a whole new world of geoscience and safety together that we've never seen before. Diego, I've just looked at your LinkedIn page. I can see you're doing similar work to this in Perth and Sydney. So I guess that's a great collaboration we're doing there. But thanks very much. So that's it from Finding Petroleum and Carbon Capture Journal for about 3 weeks. We're going to have a double bill on March the 28th. We're going to look at large language models for geoscience with Paul Cleverly. Then we're going to go to California at 3 o'clock with Cretes Jenkins from Road Subsurface Assessment is going to give his perspective on ways to quantify and mitigate subsurface risk in CO2 storage projects. So that's it from us today, and thank you very much. Have a great weekend. We'll see you soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.